So we've got some data on the best policies to advance the protein transition. There's scientific consensus that we need Western countries to be reducing their meat consumption in terms of environmental outcomes, in terms of public health outcomes, in terms of food security prospects. So here are some policies that governments can implement to help to achieve that end. We're going to be looking at an analysis of how these policies actually work to reduce meat production and consumption, as well as some data on their political popularity, which translates into their political feasibility. You can only really implement policies that people will vote for, or at least that people won't vote against. So there's 4 categories of policies that we're going to talk about. The first is financial, the second is regulatory, the third is informational, and the fourth is behavioural. So the first policy that everybody tends to think of when they think about reducing animal product consumption and production is animal product taxes. Tax something, it costs more for people to do, people are going to be inclined to do it less. Makes sense, but unfortunately it's a terribly unpopular policy. As you can see here, it was actually the least popular policy that we polled. This is a list of policies. You're going to see this list a few times in this presentation. Basically, more green means that more people support the idea, and more red means that more people oppose the idea. And as you can see here, a 20% tax on meat was opposed by almost 70% in this UK survey. So a meat tax amongst the least politically palatable solutions. This has been discussed in Germany, where the standard VAT rate is 19%, but meat is subject to a reduced rate of 7%. That's actually quite a common setup in a lot of countries where meat is subject to a lower rate of VAT. So there's sort of a tax exemption on meat products, even though they're causing us all these negative externalities. So correcting that and bringing that in line with the standard VAT rate is one way that governments can approach increasing the rate of tax on meat. There's also been other approaches. For example, Denmark looked at this approach where they were going to introduce a tax on saturated fats that would then end up including animal products, and there was some debate and discussion around that as to whether that should include red meat and so on. So when governments have these kind of proxy taxes on saturated fat or on emissions, there can be industry attempts to carve out exemptions for their category. On the plus side for taxes, they likely are effective at reducing animal product consumption. They're going to put the price up, fewer people are going to consume them. They also earn revenue for the government, rather than actually costing the government money to implement, like a lot of these solutions will. So they'll be positive for the government's balance sheet. However, they are very politically unpopular, and if applied by health, for example saturated fat, or environment, for example carbon taxes, they could actually drive increased consumption of smaller bodied animals, which is an animal welfare issue as well. If we nudge people from beef to chicken, for example, that's likely actually causing worse animal welfare outcomes. So another reason to be wary of these kind of proxy taxes. The other side of the coin there is alternative protein subsidies. So you can of course subsidise the production and consumption of alternatives, and that is a lot more politically popular. Here we see 57% in favour of these subsidies in the UK, whereas we only had 16% in favour of the meat tax, so much higher support for the subsidies for plant-based alternatives. This is relevant because our survey data indicates that price is one of the top reasons why people have reduced their consumption of plant-based meat if they said that they had. Another approach is to invest in research and development and infrastructure for alternative proteins, and again this is very popular. In our UK sample we had 62% in favour of investing in better alternative proteins. And that ties in with actually the number one reason that people said that they had reduced their consumption of plant-based meats, which was to do with taste and texture. If we can invest in improving alternatives to animal products, it will make people much more willing to replace them. So the next set of policies is regulatory, and here we're going to talk about a few things which apply directly either on the consumption or the production side. Unlike taxes or subsidies, these are just going to be strict rules that the government sets and says this is the limit for such behaviours. So on the production side first, regulating animal production is of course something that most governments already do to some extent. There will be animal welfare regulations to some extent. There will also be environmental regulations, worker safety regulations, a bunch of other things that animal farms need to do in order to comply with the relevant laws. Improving on-farm animal welfare standards was the most supported policy that we polled. You can see here 91% were in favour of this. So this is not a marginal policy at all. When you ask people, should we improve the on-farm animal welfare standards, 91% in favour. You really don't see that many people agreeing on much these days. 91% is huge. Better animal welfare standards on farms is something where there is really near consensus in the UK, and so pushing for improving these standards should be fairly tractable politically. For example, in the UK, here's some data on the proportion of people who find various common animal farming practices to be acceptable. In red, the proportion who find them to be unacceptable. And as you can see here, between 70 and 95% are saying that these commonly practiced animal farming practices are not acceptable. Another reason why we might want to regulate production of animal products is because factory farms are putting farmers out of work. This is a graph of the tons of meat produced in red and the number of agricultural jobs in blue over the last 60 years in the UK. And as you can see, UK meat production was 87% up in this time, so almost doubled, but agricultural employment was 68% down. So we almost doubled meat production whilst taking 2/3 of agricultural jobs out of the system. And that is thanks to factory farming, why we're seeing so many farming jobs disappear and get worse, and farmers push more and more towards intensification. It's a similar picture in the US. We see meat production 192% up and agricultural employment 49% down, so almost tripling the amount of meat produced, whilst cutting in half the number of agricultural jobs in the US over the last 60 years. Brazil is an interesting one to look at because they were sort of late to intensify a lot of their agricultural systems, and you can see a clear point at which the agricultural jobs start to go down in Brazil, while of course that meat production line is still rising throughout. So the other side of the coin to regulating production is regulating consumption and trying to put into place some sort of restrictions on animal product consumption. Typically, this is only really feasible to do in public catering settings, so where the government is in charge of the catering, for example in schools, hospitals, prisons, or also in public canteens for public sector workers. This is something where there is some amount of support. We had 45% in favour of this policy, but 32% opposed. So there was more in favour than opposed, but there was, it was one of the contentious ones. And we can see a couple of examples where this has been implemented. There was a meatless day implemented in some French schools, which sparked this protest. There was also attempts by the government in Denmark to directly restrict the number of days that they could serve meat in state canteens, but unfortunately there was backlash from the workers' unions and the government had to walk away from that policy. Denmark has had a lot of success since then with different approaches to dietary change, but fair to say that they learnt from this. Trying to directly restrict animal product consumption is one of the more politically contentious approaches to this. So next up we'll talk about informational measures, and the first instance of this is in national dietary guidelines. So there was decent support for this, with 48% in favour of these policies and 24% opposed, so about twice as many in favour as opposed, recommending limits on meat and animal products in national dietary guidelines. Of course, a lot of national dietary guidelines do already do this, and many of them have been made more progressive with respect to meat reduction. For example, in the last few years, we've seen Canada updating their dietary guidelines to include more plant-based foods at the expense of meat and dairy, and China planning to implement dietary guidelines which reflect about a 50% cut from current consumption rates. Changes to national dietary guidelines to promote more plant-based foods and fewer animal-based foods are relatively popular, but unfortunately they seem to have a limited direct impact on behaviour. Most people are not directly looking to their country's dietary guidelines to determine what they're going to eat. That said, there is going to be some indirect effect of these guidelines via schools, medicine and public procurement policies. These things are likely to reflect the national dietary guidelines. For example, government catering is likely to say that these foods have to be in line with what we're telling our citizens that it's healthy to eat. So achieving changes to national dietary guidelines, while it has a limited impact directly on behaviour, probably does have an impact at the institutional level. Another labelling related point is on liberal labelling for alternative proteins. We've seen a few examples in the UK where we have cocoa dairy free, you won't see the word milk on that packaging at all. This product is no longer available. This was called This Is Not Milk, with this kind of drop in place of the I in milk, so there's a misspelling and also an explicitly not milk. This is no longer available because there have been moves to further implement restrictions on the labelling of dairy alternatives with quote-unquote misleading labels. So the claim here is that this packaging that says this is not milk might be mistaken by consumers for in fact being milk. We've got another example here, very, very clear, right? Vegan fishless fingers, very clear that this one is allowed currently, but again, industry interests are going to be pushing to restrict these labels on alternative proteins. Here's my favourite example that has been claimed to be misleading by the industry. This isn't chicken. I don't know what clearer labelling you could have to indicate that something isn't chicken. The next point on the informational measures is around animal welfare and eco-labels. These are both well-supported policies. We found 49% in favour of carbon labels on food products, and to our surprise, much higher support for animal welfare labels. That came in at 74% in favour, with only 7% opposed. This is an example of what eco-labelling might look like on food products, and the key thing to note here, of course, is that this would imply a negative label, a high environmental impact label for beef products, and a low environmental impact for alternative proteins. This is borne out by various life cycle assessments which show that the climate impact of plant-based alternatives is on the order of 90% lower than the climate impact of beef. I will say animal advocates should approach this policy with some caution, because it can also lead to this effect where we're pushing people from beef to chicken, for example, which is actually going to be a net negative for animal welfare. Of course, much more well supported, as we saw in the data, is animal welfare labelling. These are some of the labels that are currently available in the UK for animal welfare labelling. There's a range of privately paid certification schemes which are all opt-in and all have these kind of similar but different looking logos and standards. It gets really confusing for consumers. The UK government is currently looking at improving this system and introducing these mandatory welfare labels on all animal products sold in the UK. And these, of course, would be much clearer for consumers to see relative to other animal products, what's the welfare implications of this animal product. When you have this range of privately administered private organisations doing certification schemes, it gets very confusing for consumers. There's also perverse incentives in there, because of course if you're paying me £10,000 a year to give you this welfare certification, where's my incentive to come and inspect your farm and maybe kick you off the scheme? Well, I don't have one because I'll lose £10,000 a year in revenue. There's also a weird selection effect where you have animal welfare labelling optional. Of course, companies are only going to disclose it if it's good news, and so as a result of that, it skews the perception of the whole category. You can imagine a world where health labelling was optional, and most cake producers would say that's great, we don't have to put our red traffic lights on the front of the packaging saying that cakes are unhealthy anymore. Now maybe some cake producers, which are the particularly healthy cakes, opt to put their green traffic light labels out still, and as a result of that, as a consumer, when you walk down the cake aisle, you see nothing but green lights, you might come out thinking, cakes are pretty healthy. So it makes sense to make it mandatory to disclose this information. When you make it optional to disclose any information, no one's telling you if it's bad news. And finally, we're going to look at behavioural measures. This is really in the context of government catering and other situations where the government has direct control over how foods are served and presented. It could also be incentivised in private food businesses, and these are all methods which are shown to move the needle on animal product consumption. So the first one is just having more and better alternatives available. This is an experiment where they provided menus which were either 25% vegetarian options at the top there, 50% vegetarian options in the middle row, or 75% vegetarian options. And as you can see, there's a modest increase between the first two, but where you get really a jump in vegetarian selection is where you have the majority of the menu made up of vegetarian options. And it makes sense, right? You're just more likely to see a vegetarian option that you like if the majority of the menu is vegetarian. Still, in that case, 50% chose meat, but that's not bad. It's down from 75% choosing meat, so that's an improvement. This is some survey data showing how much satisfaction with meat alternatives has improved in just the space of 1 year. This is data from 2019 and 2020, where we found that 44% said they were satisfied with meat alternatives in 2019, and that jumped to 51% in 2020. So a 7 percentage point jump, and a majority of people from 2020 saying that they were satisfied with meat alternatives. And here's some taste rankings for various products. I'm covering up the one here that says Impossible Burger. This also included Beyond Burgers, beef burgers, and a hybrid of meat and mushroom burgers. This is an inverted rank, so we've displayed the data such that higher bars means better. And you can see that the Impossible Burger was ranked as the best tasting versus Beef Burger, Beyond Burger, and a blended burger in both blind and informed conditions. I'll say that again, the Impossible Burger was ranked higher than the Beef Burger for taste in blind and informed conditions. So we are already getting there in terms of taste preference over animal products. There's a great video on my channel called Plant-Based Alternatives Are Getting Better and Cheaper, which looks at some of the data from the Nectar project about this point too. The next point is about different names and frames used when talking about alternatives to meat. So this is relative sales of the same vegetarian sausage and mash dish when it was given various different names. And you can see that basically when it has these kind of more elaborate labels that focus on provenance and introduce taste, it does much better than when it's just called meat-free sausage and mash. We can see also that vegetarian dishes are much more likely to be chosen when they have a tasty label compared to when they have a healthy label, and there's a few studies that make this point. When framing vegetarian food or vegan food as healthy, we may be correct, but we may be actually putting off more people than we're turning on. In some circumstances, what you really want to do is focus on the tastiness and the appeal of those products rather than the health aspect primarily. Here's a neat study that used two different menu designs. You can see that the menu on the left has the vegetarian options mixed in with the other options and just indicated with this V in parentheses, and the menu on the right has the vegetarian options in their own separate vegetarian dishes section of the menu. Perhaps you can guess the punchline. When we have this mixed menu, there's over twice as many people choosing the vegetarian option as compared to when we put them in their own segregated vegetarian section. So mixing them in, having mixed menus opposed to segregated menus is the way to go. And the final points are on favourable positioning of dishes and, most importantly, defaults. So there's a modest effect of putting the vegetarian options first in buffet settings. Essentially, people get to those options first and fill up their plates, and then they're less likely to choose meat as a result. But there's a huge effect of having the vegetarian option as the default. In settings that have defaults, there can be a default presented where you either have to request to have the vegetarian option or you have to request not to have the vegetarian option. If it's framed as you have to request not to have the vegetarian option, selection of the vegetarian option increases dramatically. Defaults are probably the most powerful and consistent behavioural intervention that we know of with respect to increasing selection of meat-free dishes. So to summarise then, we've got animal product taxes which are not very well supported politically and therefore will be quite difficult to try to implement. We've got alternative protein subsidies and investment in alternative proteins R&D and infrastructure, which is much more favoured by the public. So implementing these subsidies and investing in improving alternatives to meat is much more popular than taxing meat and animal products. Regulating animal production is very popular and something that we already do and should do more of. There is 91% support for improved animal welfare standards on farms in the UK. Restricting animal product consumption, on the other hand, in terms of meat-free days in public catering and things like this, tends to be a little bit more contentious and should be approached with some caution. You might get some backlash there, you might be wasting political capital on these interventions which are less popular. In terms of information, we need liberal labelling for alternative proteins, and there's also good public support for animal welfare and eco-labels on food products. In particular, animal welfare labels is something that is widely supported, and the UK government is looking at implementing that currently. Dietary guidelines are limited in their direct effect on behaviour, but do inform public procurement decisions as well as what's taught in schools and used in the medical context, so are important to influence for indirect purposes. And in terms of behavioural measures, more and better alternatives to meat, appealing naming and framing of alternatives that focuses on their taste appeal and not necessarily on their health appeal or their vegetarian status, and favourable positioning in terms of putting vegetarian options first in the buffets and presenting them as the default in situations where there is a default. Well, there you go. This is Chris Bryant, PhD. Cheers.